If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hey everyone, Jacob Winograd here. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I have for you guys a bonus episode today. This is an appearance I did on another YouTube channel, which goes by the name of Eschatology Matters. I've watched some of their content before. They tend to lean in a post-mill and Christian nationalist direction, although that's not necessarily all of their identity. And I don't remember the actual channel founder's name, but I talked with a gentleman known as Josh Howard, if I have that name correct. And Josh has a PhD at Midwestern Seminary. He is also Reformed and a contributor at what's known as Clear Truth Media. And he often guest hosts different interviews and episodes of the Eschatology Matters YouTube channel, although he is not like their main spokesperson or anything. So I want to make that clear. But Eschatology Matters wanted to do a series on addressing a question regarding if Christian nationalism is dead or not. And they put a little little feeler out post on Twitter or X asking for the best people to have on to talk about Christian nationalism and criticize Christian nationalism were, and enough people tagged me that they reached out to me and we were able to set something up. It's already come out on their channel and they agreed to let me publish it on mine after a certain amount of time has passed, and that time has come, and it was a good conversation. I hope to have more conversations with Josh in the future. We kind of covered a lot of, I suppose, basic ground. It won't necessarily be things that are too new if you're familiar with my views and have listened to the podcast before, but he does present some objections to my view that, or potential objections, and also some things that are going to perhaps be doorways to future conversations regarding some of the specific nuances of Reformed philosophy and covenant theology. And so I am happy to dive more into those in the future, although I try to pick and choose, I guess, what sorts of particulars I dive into on this podcast. But we bring up something regarding republication, which is a specific view within covenant theology and the Reformed worldview. And we don't define it much in there, and I'm not even prepared to give you a really big definition of what it is here, but it might be something I do a future episode on, so keep your eyes open for that. I'm probably going to do a bonus episode next week as well before I resume regular programming, just because I'm been traveling a bunch lately and haven't had a chance to sit down and do any normal episodes yet. But yeah, so I have a couple appearances I've done, so we're going to publish those for you guys to listen to, because I know you don't always see those sorts of things. So that's all I have for you guys. I hope you enjoy this conversation, and I'll talk to you on the flip side.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters on the Fight, Laugh, Feast Network, also available on Boniface Media. If you want to start reading the Puritans, but you don't know where to begin, I want to commend to you Puritan Treasures for Today, which is available from Reformation Heritage Books. It makes the riches of those godly writers of old accessible to the modern reader. With updated language and helpful introductions, these classic works from John Owen, Jeremiah Burroughs, and more are the perfect starting point for the curious reader. You can learn more about the Puritan Treasures for Today at heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. Again, that's heritagebooks.org/Puritan Treasures. When you're in the checkout or the cart, use the code EMatters for 10% off your order. EMatters. I'm joined today by Jacob Winograd. And Jacob, first of all, thank you for coming on Eschatology Matters before I introduce the topic du jour.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Jake, you are, and I'm gonna persistently call you Jake on accident, so I'm just going to apologize from the front end. Jacob, you're coming on a little series that we're doing, a sort of mini series, asking the question and trying to answer it maybe from a couple of different viewpoints. Is Christian nationalism dead? Now, just from talking to you a little bit briefly before the show, I think you're going to bring a really interesting introductory perspective on this. This is a new series. To give our viewers a little bit of background, we plotted this out in the fall of last year. A lot has transpired since that point, but we decided to soldier through and go ahead and address this question because it was around the fall of last year. There was a couple of prominent voices, specifically on social media, areas like that said that Christian nationalism was dead as a movement. We found that very interesting. At Eschatology Matters, we have some of our contributors that would very, very wholeheartedly identify as Christian nationalists, some who would absolutely not. And then you have some in the middle, like me, for example, who would not identify as Christian nationalist, but I find much in common with those who are. So I count myself as a sort of sympathetic voice there. But we were looking at this movement and just asking ourselves, well, is the movement dead? And if it is dead, who killed it or why did it die? If it's not dead, what are the reasons that it's not dead? What can we be looking for around the corner? Usually when you see some sort of movement like Christian nationalism, you see things either spiral out of control or you see them start to build and coalesce and define themselves a bit better. So that was sort of some of our walk-in here. But before we jump into that, tell us a little bit about yourself. If you could give just maybe a quick bio, let everybody know where you're at. Be sure to mention if you're active on social media. I know you're on the Twitter and anything else you've got going on, Jacob.
Yes. Yeah, I'm active on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it these days.
It's always Twitter.
Find me.
It's always going to be Twitter.
The at Biblical Anarchy would be my handle. You can find me. So I am a member of the Libertarian Christian Institute, one of our hosts of our Christians for Liberty network. I'm the host of what's called the Biblical Anarchy podcast, and I do commentary on politics, current events, also looking back on history, studying things from the Christian worldview, and obviously I, have a strong influence from libertarian philosophy and economics as well. I would say that I'm also coming from a mostly, reformed or maybe lowercase r reformed perspective when I'm approaching certain things. So, I appreciate covenant theology and, God's sovereignty and election and things like that, which I know overlaps with a lot of the Christian nationalist world as well. A lot of them tend to be reformed, although not all. There's some Christian nationalist Catholics and Orthodox as well. But yeah, that's what I do. You can find more about me at biblicalanarchypodcast.com. If you're also, I'll just plug, we have a book here at the Libertarian Christian Institute called Faith Seeking Freedom. Just figured I'd plug that quick in case you want to know more what it means to be a Christian libertarian, although some of that will probably come out in this conversation, I imagine. So
yeah, I'm curious about kind of the intersection of the libertarian angle, but let's walk into it this way, Jacob, and feel free to direct this a little bit differently, but I'm wondering if it might be good at the outset, not a textbook definition. I'm not sure there even is one that we could agree on or that everybody would agree on, but maybe like your working definition for what you're addressing as Christian nationalism, maybe just even a brief one. Obviously you're recommending a book there. There's a lot there to define, but maybe just a little bit of a jumping off definition of where you're coming at as a libertarian. And also what's your identification with this movement? Do you see yourself identified with Christian nationalism? Or are you sort of an involved observer? Walk me into a little bit of that.
Yeah. So Christian nationalism, I guess there's a lot of different types of it or different people who might have, varying perspectives on it. And I guess if there's a uniting principle about like why people would adopt that label, I would say it's sort of a group of people who have a belief that like if we're going to have a nation, if we're going to have a government, then that nation's identity and that governance should be explicitly defined by and aligned with Christian principles. Now, how does that work and what does that mean? That can take different forms. I would say it often involves some sort of integration of Christian doctrine into, public policies, laws, cultural norms, and that, the government has some sort of responsibility to, sort of like establish a civil religion. And again, that can be full-blown theonomy, and then you have someone like Stephen Wolfe who argues for something that isn't coming from a theonomic worldview, but still argues that there can be some place for government to enforce certain things like Sabbath laws or certain other Christian practices to be enshrined in law, or at least for the government to sort of recognize and protect Christian interests. And I would say the other sort of fundamental assumption is that it's a rejection of a sort of like liberalism and the idea that there can be either pluralism in society and culture, or a rejection of a sort of like neutrality in these things, and that it would, I think Christian nationalists tend to approach that like we can't have neutrality in culture and governance and any of these areas of civil life. And so if the choice is between, being governed by secular people with secular values or being governed by Christian people with Christian values, that would seem to be an easy choice. So and I guess where I'm coming from, I mean, there's certain parts of that I would kind of agree with, but I think the devil's in the details, to use a sort of weird expression there.
Right.
The Christian libertarian view would uphold in a sort of general sense that, yeah, I don't think that you can have neutrality in any aspect of life, whether that's culture, whether that's government. But I think it comes down to like, well, what do we then look to as the state? What is government? What distinguishes government from other areas of civil life? I kind of am influenced more by kind of the Kuyperian idea of, viewing society in the realm of spheres and kind of viewing each sphere as somewhat independent and sovereign, although they do connect and interact with each other. So, what distinguishes the sphere of civil governance from the sphere of the family, from the sphere of the church? We need to understand what Scripture teaches us about that, and then what government is prescribed to do. And I come away with different answers, obviously, than many Christian nationalists do. And I don't read libertarianism into the text. I don't perform any kind of eisegesis, but I do think that when we examine, certain scriptures like Romans 13, which is often cited, even looking at, understanding the development of civil governance over time, understanding covenant theology, what the Mosaic covenant was about, we understand that civil governance has to have certain limits on it, and it's there to, I think, pursue very narrow goals of civil justice, and that would be basically the enforcement of property rights, handling matters of aggression, and I don't think that would extend into the enforcement of the use of force against actions which are in themselves non-aggressive. And so I guess that's sort of an opening explanation of how I view Christian nationalism, and then a little bit of where I'm coming from.
Yeah, no. Yeah, the devil's definitely in the details, right? So I'm trying to think, because what you're describing, not to just put it in the terms of camps, because I don't know how helpful I find that at times with this discussion, but at least what you're presenting seems familiar with some of the things specifically out of Moscow, Idaho, where it's a sort of, they would describe it as, or many of them would describe it as sort of a general equity theonomic perspective or something like that. But you're looking at sort of the general equity of God's law. Again, there's details to work through in the application thereof, but it's the rejection of a neutral sphere or neutral public, space or political entity. It's the affirmation of God's law being, again, to whatever degree the God for just laws and just practices. But then it's also, as you just said, a loosely defined, and I say loosely in a charitable sense, insofar as we're not going the whole way of Kuyper in some of those regards, but it's a loosely held conception of Kuyperian sphere sovereignty, where, okay, there's different spheres, state, family, etc., that we don't want to trespass. I wonder if what you see, because I wonder, number one, how well you define with Christian nationalism. Like, is what you're sort of presenting, is that what most people would see as Christian nationalist? And number two, if it's not, where do you maybe see some of those divergences? And maybe we can tease out some of those threads of where do you see your view either aligning or not aligning with Christian nationalism? Because what it seems that in a lot of these conversations happens is it's the degree to which one takes a thread. So, for example, we both may agree that God's laws are good and should be the form and basis for political laws. Especially when we're talking about things like inherently explicitly moral laws like murder, rape, etc. Not talking about what speed limit your neighborhood should have. So we both agree on that sort of general principle. I think a lot of these conversations come down to how far do you apply it and how far are you allowed to apply that biblically through a state structure. In other words, how far does that agreed upon starting point, how far can you run down a political alley with it? That seems to be part of this conversation with Christian nationalism. But before I ramble on a bit, how do you see yourself aligned with Christian nationalism, with what you're kind of presenting, Jacob? And then if there's divergence, where are you starting to see some of that?
Yeah. So, and I tend to be among Christian libertarians, and I think this is just my personality type. I'm very ecumenical, and I just by nature, I'm always trying to find common ground. And also, I tend to see that Christian nationalists are often railing against the same political and cultural enemies that I rail against. And so I do want to foster some sense of that, like, even though we disagree on certain things, that we could perhaps be allies in a political sense in this sort of, Christian right-wing dissidence that, sort of has coalesced on the right. I tend to agree, I guess, with the big picture that, so I don't think we can have neutrality, but I think where the pretty hard divergence comes from, like, what does the Bible define civil governance as being and being for? And I come away with wildly different answers from both like theonomists and even guys like Wolf. I think that, so like we could talk about like a key passage, right? Like Romans 13, just to sort of springboard what I'm talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of people read Romans 13 and think that it is a sort of like a description de facto of all organizations or groups that call themselves government or the state. And I don't think that's correct. I think that Romans 13 is rather a description of just governance because of in the text, and I don't have it in front of me, so I'm just going off memory here to just describe it in my own words. Romans 13 says that the civil magistrate bears the sword in pursuit of protecting the innocent and is not a terror to those who do good works. And so we see that within this description, there's sort of a prescription being offered, a sort of like, operating on like what a civil government exists to do. And I think that, and this isn't just like my view, I think that many reformers had this view, even, guys like Chrysostom and more earlier church fathers tended to agree that it doesn't just describe anyone who holds the office, but Romans 13 is upholding those who use the office correctly. You can compare this to like the authority of like a husband, right? That like, a husband has authority over his wife and his family to a certain extent, but that obviously that like the command to like submit to your husband means that like when he's using that authority justly, not when he's using that authority to harm his wife or to lead her into sin or anything like that. So that would apply to government as well, that like government is there to uphold what is just, and when it's not just, we don't have a obligation to follow it. Now, that can sometimes sound close to what the theonomists are claiming, right? That like, because the theonomic worldview would be close to what I'm describing, except that I just think that then like the application is strictly on a civil understanding of good and evil, not all good and evil, right? I don't think that the civil magistrate is there to deal with non-aggressive sin, is what it comes down to. There's several arguments for this. I would argue like from Genesis 9, where we have the establishment of the Noahic covenant, and it's sort of like the institution of civil governance in a sense, where it's if there'll be an accounting for the lifeblood of man, and if a man's life is taken, then by another man shall his life be taken. And so there's this idea of proportionality or just retribution that's introduced there. And I think Romans 13 is sort of hearkening back to that, to say that, in God's order and sort of the common grace order we live under, that if there are, I'm not a pacifist, right? So that there should be retribution and force used against those who initiate force against others. And I think that is the role of civil governance. So if I do take more of a Kuyperian view, it's like we tend to describe what is normative for the authority of the family, for the authority of the church. And then so when we're doing this for civil governance, and I just gave you a really quick, like, five-minute overview where I could go on in much more detail, but that's sort of the explanation of where I diverge hardly from many Christian nationalists, is that, and why I describe that as Christian libertarianism, because it corresponds with the libertarian principle of the non-aggression principle that, so the way libertarianism defines it is that, it's wrong to initiate force against those who themselves have not initiated force or committed any kind of aggression. And I think that is essentially what the Bible prescribes for civil governance, although that obviously is a little bit different in the Mosaic covenant context. I think there's reasons for that, mainly due to the limited establishment of a theocratic system, which no longer is in effect today, which is why I'm not a theonomist. So I would say that's largely where the divergence comes from, is how we, what are we defining as normative for the role and the scope of civil governance.
Okay, yeah. So let me ask a couple of maybe clarifying questions, because a lot of what you said is very familiar. I'm just wondering about a couple of these things. So, for example, when you said that the state, and this has been, like you said, you're not alone in this viewpoint. And in fact, I'm trying to think of some really good recent examples. It seems like they just had a book that was published on this topic. But looking at Romans 13, and you're looking at the role of the government and looking at what invalidates a government's rule. In other words, when does a government become tyrannical, or even we could say antichrist? So if a government is antichrist, do you have to submit to it based on Romans 13? This is the COVID hangover that everybody's still coming out of, right? COVID hit. Many well-meaning pastors said, "Hey, if you should wear red silly hats because the government said to, then you should do that." And I don't think that's supported from Romans 13. So there's been a lot of footwork in that area. Let's assume the government does something that looks wrong, but is not just a blatant violation of God's law, or even maybe if it is a blatant violation. But let's just say the government does something that looks biblically, ethically, morally questionable, at least to the point where they may well have trespassed what Romans 13 contains, based on what you brought up a minute ago. And so the Christian is sitting there, and it's going to impact, let's just say, every family in your church in one regard or another. This isn't something you can wave your hand and say, well, that's for those people over there. So it's going to affect you, and you have to make a decision on that. My question is, because we're talking about Christian nationalism, right? My question is, who do you see as like the deciding force to say the government's gone too far in this regard? Like, does that fall to the individual Christian to say, I stand here, I have decided the government has gone too far based on my reading of Scripture? Is that something that is in the realm of the church, since we were talking about kind of, loosely defined Kuyperian sphere sovereignty?
So I mean, within like Kuyper's idea, like the spheres are distinct in their sovereignty, but that's not to say they don't interact, right? Like the church can interact with the sphere of the family, for example. So like I have authority over my family, but I also submit to the stewardship of my pastor, and he can speak into my life and say, I think, in this one example, you're not behaving in a Christian way in terms of how you're either neglecting your husbandly duties or your fatherly duties, or both, or something. You're not being a good provider. You're not leading in a Christ-like fashion. And so the church can, I think, absolutely. And like you brought up COVID. I think the church missed the mark overwhelmingly during the COVID years. That should have been an instance where the church said, actually, no, this is not an area over which you have jurisdiction. And so that would have been a good time for the church to come together and to say that not only do you not have, is it not the church's role to decide for, in mass hundreds of millions of people, what sorts of risks they are willing to take with their own personal health, because that's not only it's not their job, but how could they even come to a accurate risk assessment for hundreds of millions of people with all different sorts of health considerations that they have to determine. But and then beyond that, when they said, and also churches aren't going to meet, that was even a bigger offense in my mark, because if the state's ever going to come in and tell the church that we aren't allowed to gather, I mean, that's hearkening back to the, it was nonviolent, but still it was absolutely resistance on the part of the very first Christians to continue to meet in spite of many edicts and efforts by the Roman Empire to prevent Christians from gathering and from preaching the gospel. So I would say then, so who gets to do that? I mean, yeah, the church can do it, individuals can do it. And in terms of the operating principle, I think it's, that's why I think defining what civil governance is there to do is important. And I think it is there as the civil magistrate is not there as an enforcer of all morality. I think it is there as an enforcement of narrowly good and evil in the civil sense. So meaning concerning civil rights and obligations, which generally come down to disputes over property. And I would extend that to even like, aggression being threatened against your actual life. So when your life is in danger, your liberty is, your property is in danger, or it's been infringed upon, theft, sexual assault, murder, breach of contract. Like this is the role, the sphere in which civil governance operates. And I think that is the jurisdiction it is to operate over. But just as I would go to, say, like Christian progressives and say, no, it's not the role of the civil magistrate to actually go and take 40% of everyone's income and then redistribute it to people based on, like them living in poverty or needing health care or something like that. Like, maybe the church can take voluntary tithes and contributions and distribute them to people as they see fit. That's a role for church, for charity, voluntary organizations, but that's not the role of the magistrate. And I would also say, for sort of maybe pick an example here, I don't think that blasphemy falls under the jurisdiction of the civil magistrate either. And now with Christians, we should obviously defend our faith, make a good defense of it. And there is a question about what should be allowed on public spaces, right? But in terms of private spaces and what people do on their own property, or what people say in the public sphere, I don't think that it is within the realm of the civil magistrate in the new covenant common grace order we live under to pass laws on that, because it doesn't fall into a actual dispute over property or an act of aggression.
Okay. So is that then, because I want to press to the question of, is Christian nationalism dead? I'm not sure. As we could have forecast, we're not going to probably have time to walk through a host of definitions for Christian nationalism, but just again, in your estimation and kind of like by what you're seeing going on, I'm curious if you see it dead. But before we get there, is that what you see as sort of the divergence from what you're talking about with a sort of Christian libertarian approach, one that we might say is adjacent to or friendly to some of the more notable Christian nationalist expressions? You're just saying, well, there's a severe curtailing or limitation placed upon the government that you're seeing more of within Christian nationalist circles, because my mind is drawn to this obviously. There's a long history of this sort of thought within, even within American political thought. You have, Thomas Jefferson with the famous, if my neighbor doesn't break my leg or arm or pick my pocket, whichever, I can't remember if it was the leg or the arm right now. But, if somebody does not, do me assault or take from me, then, they're to go their own way and I'm to go mine, sort of and a lot of taken, quotes of that nature to be more libertarian. You have, within my tradition, you have some of the Westminster documents, you have the American Revision, which sort of took back or curtailed, or at least didn't explicitly advance a lot of the role of the state. The state's still described as a nursing father or mother. There's a nursing.
No, the American revisions definitely, they even kind of rolled back more of the kind of like establishmentarianist sort of sentiment that were in the original confessions. So
right, at least made it non-binding or non-required, right? Not prohibiting it and yet not requiring it within the American revision for sure. So is that sort of what you're seeing, and what you're kind of, is that maybe one of those differentiations between what you're advocating with Christian libertarianism?
Yeah, I would say it's very much, and insofar as I'm influenced by the Reformed perspective, which I'll also plug my friends over at reformedlibertarians.com, and they are more in your camp. They're actual confessional Presbyterian Reformed, although they attend. My friend Greg attends an OPC church, not PCA, but yeah, I think even the confessions I think would at least be compatible with what we're defining here in terms of like what where the divergence is. I think that.
Jacob, is that, by the way, is that what you meant earlier? Sorry to cut you off. Is that what you meant when you talked? You mentioned, I think, aggressive offenses earlier, or something along those lines. Is that sort of what you were referring to? Was the offenses that immediately, kind of impinge on others, and maybe not?
I can help explain this more from a biblical perspective. I think it's really just understanding the principle of proportional justice taught in Genesis 9, but just to really drive that home, if we think about that principle and we logically extract what's being taught there is an emphasis that this is the first time God has really given like an explicit command sanctioning the use of violence against a crime, but he says that it's to be used against when someone else has initiated aggression against someone, right? And that's proportional. And so if to uphold that proportional principle, I think that and again, that's not the only passage, but that's sort of the first one and foundational. If you initiate force against something that we would both call sin, so let's say, I don't know, I guess like gay marriage, right? I don't think that it's. I think it is sinful for two men to live together and to say that they're married. Now, ideally, I just want the state out of marriage altogether, but insofar as the state is involved in marriage and two men get together and say they're married, it's not the role, like there's no act of aggression there. So if you were to then pass a law that went to people who aren't committing aggression and then used force to stop them from doing something, that would break proportionality. And so that's kind of an example of like that limiting principle, I think, that's in effect, which is, it sounds very libertarian. Like I said before, the libertarian conception is the non-aggression principle. And so, yeah, like it's a very, I guess, black and white principle in terms of that, like the role of civil governance, because it is an instrument, as Romans 13 says, it wields the sword. And I think that sword wielding is inherently only to be used in proportionality, and that when you break proportionality, you are actually, you are distorting the actual biblical use. And again, I know and I'm trying to not go off into tangents, because I know there would be some objections about what about the laws in the Mosaic covenant with theocratic Israel? I'm hoping that you people from your audience who are mostly Reformed, I think, would understand that there are covenantal aspects to this, right? I don't know, within the Dutch tradition, there's this term that I think Meredith Kline coined called eschatological intrusion, which I think is sort of an explanation of why there's a different set of principles that kind of operate within the Mosaic covenant. But needless to say, I could go, I can recommend resources, or we can talk about that at a different time if you want to. I don't want to go too much in the weeds, but yeah, I do think that is a strong divergence between, again, and the core concerns that Christian nationalists have, I tend to understand. We have been ruled by secularists and liberalism for a while, and the fruits of that are not very good. I just think that to then take the reins of power to then say, well, the answer is we need to put Christians back in control of these institutions, but then continue to play the same game of using the state to fight the culture war, using the state and then as an instrument, using the force, using the sword that the government is is authorized to use against non-coercive sins, is not only a distortion of what the Bible teaches, but I think that tends to not work out in our favor. I would argue even within the Mosaic covenant, the fact that there were laws against sins that weren't violent didn't seem to curtail them. And actually, whenever God's people in biblical history, or even in our, I guess more like contemporary history, have tried to use the state as a curtail against sin, outside of aggressive sin, it's not a very effective instrument. And unfortunately, the only instrument that is effective is the Holy Spirit regenerating people, giving them a heart of flesh to replace a heart of stone. So that
this is what I want to push in on a bit, because what I don't want to do, and I would love to talk maybe another time even about Genesis 9, because like you said, there's a lot there. Let me frame it this way, and I'll do this by just kind of being upfront about a point of disagreement, but not to get into an argument, but to frame what I'm trying to say.
Sure.
So Meredith Kline, the Genesis 9 take, I'm familiar with his take on that. I think my argument with Kline would be that I think this is a novel take within Reformed history. I'm not convinced by the Republication perspective on Genesis 9. I think Kline does some interesting things with it that I don't think are biblically supported. So that's kind of my perspective on that. However, what I do hear common ground where I could still identify with what you're saying is, I think what you're saying, as well as the Genesis 9 argument, I also hear you saying maybe, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the sphere of authority to which these things are relegated is not that of the state, because that's the part that I think you can have substantive agreement even on disagreements within these conversations, is whether you think the state would be effective at enforcing the laws, or whether you think that it would be, those arguments are important, but I think the one that we can really actually biblically grapple with is it the state's place to enforce those things? And you're making the argument, obviously. I'm not saying you're not making a biblical argument on that. I'm thinking more toward the Kuyperian sphere sovereignty angle of, is it the proper place of the state to enforce then, let's say, sins and crimes within the home that do not actually infringe on the bodily autonomy of other individuals? Would that be a fair way of framing that?
That's a very fair way of framing it, yes.
Yeah, because I think that might help. The problem that you run into a bit when you make the Genesis 9 to Romans 13 jump is, obviously there's a lot of travel room in between those two. But what you're bringing up with the Kuyperian thing, okay, so let me use that then, and let me try to steer the ship over here to the Christian nationalism thing. So as I'm hearing you sort of articulate Christian nationalism, I'm seeing some overlap with what I think both you or I might advocate, but I think I'm hearing you say it's pushing a bit too far on the nationalism, specifically within that kind of sphere sovereignty aspect. The state is being given things that is not biblically the right of the state. The state's not called to enforce those sort of crimes. Number one, would that be sort of one of the major differentiations you would see with the modern Christian nationalist movement that we've seen, especially be, in the conversation for the last couple of years? And then with that in mind, do you see that movement as dead? Because that is our framing question: is Christian nationalism dead? So walk me into that a little bit, Jacob.
So I would agree with the framing you gave as the divergence there. As to whether or not Christian nationalism is dead, I mean, I think it has to I think it has to decide what direction it's going in. And there's been some I don't want to exaggerate how much infighting there is, but because listen, every movement has infighting, right? But I think that Christian nationalism needs to decide if it wants to move more into, I guess, like the theonomic route, or if it wants to move more into fighting the culture route, right? Because as a Kuyperian, I do I'm sympathetic to the idea that, and even as an amillennialist, I think that we should be trying to reclaim culture, and we should be trying to, transform society to bring it more into accordance with biblical principles, with Christ and his law, and that's good for society. That's a good testimony to the truth of the gospel, and I think that's part of what I don't think before the eschaton we're ever going to achieve that dominion mandate from Genesis perfectly, but we should keep that in mind, and that should be something that we care about, that we're striving towards. And if Christian nationalism was focused more on the cultural pushback and more open to hearing, okay, maybe this isn't biblically prescribed for the state to handle in certain areas, as well as, I've had some good conversations with Stephen Wolfe where, even though he diverges strongly from what I'm arguing for from the more the Kuyperian side, he's at least able to agree, what, practically, as a matter of prudence, it's probably not going to be in our best interest to fight some of these battles in the arena of law, because it's borne out throughout history not to be maybe the most effective means for doing so. So I don't know. I put it this way, I have some concerns and disagreements with the more like, I guess, like traditional mainstream right in the Christian evangelical and Republican world. And I think they get a lot of things wrong. And I think Christian nationalism is sort of again, it's a response. And insofar as the response is to point out the failures of what they're pointing to in terms of like the more, neoconservative infiltration of Christianity and evangelicalism in America, I often agree with their criticisms. And so I hope that those criticisms continue. And so insofar as I want that to continue, I don't really want the people or the movement that Christian nationalism is a part of to die. But I do think it has to sort out like what is its end goal. And if its end goal it continues to trend towards, we're going to just we're going to play the left's game, but play an opposite way, where the left spent decades taking over institutions in culture, but also in government, to then sort of push a progressive secular agenda on society and indoctrinate a lot of people into very unchristian things. We should push back against that, but I don't think that's to push back and to simply pursue. If Christian nationalism becomes pursuing Christian ends but using woke means, to put it in a succinct way, then I think it'll die in the sense of it might still be a thing, but at that point I think it'll be less Christian and just be more nationalism.
Okay, and that's a good one to push in on. Because I have a question specifically about the laws. Honestly, I would love to have talked a little bit about what you brought up there at the end about I think you used the word woke means. That would have been an interesting one. I doubt we have time for that now, but I do want to push in a little bit on the laws. But let me ask you this, because Jacob, I know you're being polite and you're avoiding saying if it's dead or if it's not dead, but like if Christian nationalism is a goat and it's in a pasture, do you see it limping? Does it have a wound and it's about to bleed out in the field? Like how well is the movement doing at this point? You're using charity and I'm with you on that. Like, charity among Christians, I think this is an intramural in-house sort of debate, but do you think the movement is doing well, or do you think it's doing poorly at this point? My goat illustration is probably going to get us like bumped off of YouTube, so just factor that in. But do you see it doing better in the last, like, say, 6 months, or is it doing worse?
I don't know. I mean, with Trump winning, and insofar as Christian nationalism is a part of the sort of like right-wing dissident pushback, that the surge that sort of led to Trump winning,
it's an interesting.
It's hard to say that it's dead, but there are some issues it has to sort out. So maybe if I'm going to use the goat analogy, like maybe the goat has like a wound, like a broken leg or something, and it's like got like the wound's exposed, and it needs to proactively seek treatment, or infection's going to sink in, and then it will die a pretty quick death after that. So that's kind of where I see it. Like, it's at a crossroads, I think, and it can either move into territory where maybe it starts to become something that I would find more common ground with, or it can move in a direction where my attempts to be ecumenical and give criticisms, but in good faith, kind of like viewing us all as still mostly on the same team, that would become harder if they move in the other direction.
Okay, that's fair, and that's fair to. Yeah, it's the constant push and pull of trying to have not even ecumenical, but just in-house conversational, brotherly debates over things. It becomes difficult when movements go a bit further afield. I'm a huge fan of yours for taking my goat analogy and actually going with it. So thanks, Jacob. Tell me this about laws, because laws, I think, are a big part of how people see this actually suss out. So you and I agree that there's cultural things to address, but like, let's just assume for the moment, we could probably try to land the plane soon after this. But if we see cultural issues afoot, we also see let's just say the part and parcel work of the kingdom, right? The work of the church, the preaching of the word, the administration of the sacraments, all these things that the church is called to do. So we see the church doing well in that regard, keeping the main things, and proclaiming the gospel faithfully, and praying, and even seeing revival in small circles and souls won to Christ. Like, let's assume God's people are doing their job, that nothing's being neglected, in other words, because that's oftentimes sort of some of the pushback of this, is that you're going to neglect something good. So let's assume God's people are doing what they're called to do. We can also recognize, as we've talked about today, that there's not neutrality. There's not a sort of neutral gear that we can shift into morally, ethically, politically. Things are always going to be trending toward the Lamb or away from Him. So we understand that. We also understand there's the power of relatively small, whether they be political or governmental movements, that can have a pretty wide influence. There's many people in our day that think things without any reason for thinking them other than a very small but influential group of people have convinced them to think these things, right? This is sort of that strange dynamic that happens. So we recognize all of that. We don't want to play the games of the world, but we're also mindful of how these things work. To what extent should Christians be looking to things like laws? Specifically, let's just focus on laws, governance even. To what extent do you see Christians looking to that with any sort of effort to Christianize or win or whatever verbiage, to see good things happen in a God-honoring fashion where laws are passed that are God-honoring, those sort of good results? To what extent should we be looking to laws for that from a Christian libertarian perspective?
So this is where, again, there's kind of some overlap, but then there's like a divergence in terms of the outcome. Because unlike maybe some critics of Christian nationalism who I think would tend to take more of a like isolationist approach to law, maybe more like an Anabaptist approach, where they're just kind of like, well, it's almost like a radical two kingdoms, right? Where it's like, well, there's the kingdoms of this world, but we're citizens of the kingdom of God and we're sojourners in this world. So like we just have to focus entirely on the gospel and the administration of churchly things, and the world's just going to do what the world's going to do. There's, I guess, tension there, right? There's maybe some things of two kingdoms theology that are somewhat correct when held in a proper viewpoint, but I'm obviously more influenced by a sort of like Hyperion model. I think that we should look to law a lot and understand that government, because of that lack of neutrality, is going to play a major role in society. And I think that the tradition that we inherit as the church, right, as the continuation of the covenant people that God established through Abraham, then through Moses, then through David, culminating in Christ, I think that we inherit the tradition that many of God's people have often done throughout the Bible of calling out the corruption and the misuse of power by kings, by empires, by governments, by those in power, when they're committing injustice, when they're leading people into idolatry, when they're leading people into sexual immorality. Like we have to call that out and work to repeal those bad laws and those bad institutions. And I guess the divergence comes from then, like, well, because I have a very limited, I think the Bible teaches a very limited prescription of what civil governance is to do. If I were to, so like, this is where I think we talked about this before we recorded, how I've said sometimes trollingly I could describe myself as Christian nationalism light. And so if, in my model, Christians get into the government, but then what they're doing isn't just kind of like, now we're going to take the levers of power and just flip them the other direction. For a lot of things, it's just going to be slashing them out of existence. And you could compare this to, like, if you were to, so your PCA, which is like an offshoot, I think, of like the PCUSA, right? So like,
PCUS,
yeah. So imagine if like you retook the PCUSA by some miracle, which has been overtaken by, for the most part, like liberalism, theological liberalism, and progressive Christianity, and you go and take over that church, and they have like, smoke machines for performing worship, and they have all sorts of like, gay pride flags, and they have all sorts of like worldly things and, things that they brought into the church that don't belong there, right? Well, you wouldn't keep those things there and then just like, well, how do we now use these to, in a way that's, upholding with our, our values? No, you would get rid of them. And I think that that's the way I think about Christians taking over government. If they were to do so, it would be to be like, hey, okay, these intelligence agencies, they're going to go, public education, that's going to go, the income tax, the IRS, that's going to go. A lot of this stuff is going to go because it's not under the jurisdiction of what the state's going to do. And that's not to say that, and so then what's left should be upheld from a Christian perspective, right? Like there's a strong libertarian argument and Christian argument against abortion. So that'd be an example where, like, yeah, like we should probably have laws protecting the unborn, right? That's that's an area where like that non-neutrality comes into effect. And then I guess the other stuff is not going to cause problems because it doesn't exist anymore. So there's nothing there to be used in one direction or the other. So I think a lot of times Christian nationalists point out all the bad ways in which state power is being used to undermine Christianity, to undermine our efforts to spread the gospel and see people and communities and nations come to Christ, or at least live in more accordance with biblical principles and have a more Christian influence in society. But to me, the solution is to just, I guess, to draw a comparison to like Lord of the Rings, is to throw the ring into the fire, at least in those areas where government has overstepped its bounds, right? Like we should not have public schools, which are basically government indoctrination camps, which are one of the major ways in which government is able to, or the secularists and progressives in government have been able to brainwash several generations into embracing certain views of like the unborn or sexual ethics as normative or as good, when that would be hard to do otherwise in such a mass scale. And this would apply to a lot of other areas as well. So I guess that's sort of the divergence then, is, like I said, it's in sort of the, if you know that they mean like step 1, step 2, step 3, like, so we agree on step 1 and step 3. It's just the step 2,
that tricky middle bit. That
tricky middle bit is where we have a major issue. And I think that my concern is that, I don't know. I think we've tried using the state to uphold Christian values on non-coercive or like non-aggression committing sins before. And it not only is it a distortion, I think, what the Bible teaches, I don't think it works out. And I think that rather what we see is that there's kind of usually an eventual blowback to where, like, I'm very concerned about like a nominal Christianity, right? And I think, like, you could say in a sense we live in a Christian nation, in a sense that like it's a very nominal Christian nation, right? In a lot of ways, even though I guess the rise of nons and what is talked about, but still there's a lot of people, even in progressive camps, right? Even in the Biden administration that's on its way out, who call themselves Christians, but like they don't really live that out. And I think Christian nationalism and if it continues to focus on using the law outside of what is prescribed, I know you said that maybe it's possible for us to do all the good Christian things, spreading the gospel, and do the other stuff, but I just tend to think that actually isn't how it works out, because there is a scarcity of time and labor and energy. And I think that with anything, I think central planning and using the government to do things like that often fosters a sense of like, you let the state handle it, and then people do tend to think, well, the state's handling it, so I don't have to. So that's my concern, though.
How about one clarifying question for me, and I don't offer this as a trap question at all, but I am curious how people, like you said, the step 2, like how you get from the step 1 to the step 3 on this. So, kind of at the heart of a lot of these conversations is the law and how you define the law, obviously, but also, looking at the moral law of God, the 10 words. So when you said, I think you brought up the issue of abortion. Am I correct? A minute ago? Yeah. So like with abortion, I agree with you. Should abortion be illegal? Should we have a law in the realm of the state, again, sphere of authority of the state? Should there be a law there that thou shalt not murder? Should the law against abortion be there? In other words, because God said thou shalt not murder? Should we be passing that law explicitly because God has set 10 commands, 10 words for us, and that undergirds all of his created order? Or should we just do that because it's a good law to have based on, fill in the blank? Like, should that be explicitly enforced because it's part of the 10 words?
I don't think that I would ground any law in the realm of civil governance on the 10 Commandments. I think I would establish it more on the different passages that speak more to what the civil magistrate is supposed to do, which still includes do not murder. So it would still apply to the unborn. And listen, like the civil magistrate wields the sword. There's different ways to enforce certain laws. There's always better and worse ways, right? Like there's ways to pass laws banning abortion that would probably not work very well compared to maybe laws that were regulating abortion versus banning it, but maybe they would work better. So I mean, there's that aspect to it, but in general, yeah, I wouldn't ground it in the Ten Commandments, because I think that would be the Ten Commandments. I think is more of a, like, those are moral principles for individuals. Now, I want the people in government to, and this is kind of, I think, also the libertarian critique here, is that the people in government should be bound to the same, moral standards that the rest of us are, right? And so I don't think that being in government wields you some kind of special get out of jail free card to where suddenly, like, if you steal or murder or, bear false witness or whatnot, that you give special license to now because you have a badge or because you won an election or anything like that. But that's different than saying what's the basis for law. And I think the basis for law is more based on the principle of proportionality and describing the civil authorities as wielders of the sword in pursuit of civil justice. I think that is what the Bible teaches, which I know there's disagreement with that, and that'd have to be, there'd have to be a robust debate to
okay. Can I get one more question in on that one?
Yeah, sure.
Because this one's fascinating to me. So let's look back pre-Genesis 9, pre-Genesis 6. There's civilizational growth prior to the flood. Cain kills Abel. It was counted as murder, and says that the ground cried out with blood. In those pre-flood societies, in whatever civil governance there was pre-flood, even if it was, among a few people of Adam's immediate progeny, should there be a law against murder, and should it be grounded in the eternal abiding moral law of God, which has been revealed to all of creation since Adam and Eve in the garden? Should that have been a law prior, in other words, to Genesis 9, or is that only something that comes post Mosaic covenant, as you were kind of framing it earlier?
I would say so. God establishes it in Genesis 9. That's a good question. I don't know if I've given that one too much thought, but my initial thought would be that God's establishing a principle of proportionality that I don't think would, I don't see why it wouldn't have also been like an unspoken principle that still would have been true before that, would be my initial assumption, but like it just wouldn't have been well defined, right? And
it could have been perhaps even spoken but not written yet, or at least inscribed as it was in the Ten Commandments.
Yeah, that's also possible. So I'd have to give that a little bit more thought to be like 100% sure, but like my initial answer to that would be I think it basically came into effect as a consequence of the fall, which I know that's a whole other can of worms. I know some Christian nationalists think that they have such a different definition of what government is that guys like Wolf in his book argue that actually like government is an inherent part of human society and nature even pre-fall, which again that's one of those big divergences that I think exists between our worldviews.
Anything, because we do need to land the plane. And yeah, there's lots here. Like you said, there's cans of worms everywhere. So we'll recognize that. Anything we left floating out there, I appreciate you kind of wandering in to making a judgment call on the Christian nationalist movement, and whether I think it was your description was essentially that there is a wound, that there's some figuring out, and that if the figuring out doesn't happen, that the thing's going to start to fester and it's going to become life threatening, or at least potentially life threatening. So the movement's not dead, and yet there's some serious issues to work through, which I think a lot of people could really sympathize with that take and see where you're coming from with that. But any floating things out there, particularly Jacob, with where you're coming at from the libertarian angle specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. So my plea, I guess, to those who find themselves in this broader camp of either being Christian nationalist or like saying, I don't know if I'm there, but like I'm sympathetic to what they're speaking to. My caution is that while I like I've said several times, I appreciate sort of some of the motivating factors and some of the forces that Christian nationalists are pushing back against. But as much as I think the church has a God-ordained role to, speak moral truths into the world, and that includes to push back against calls to call what is wicked good, to push back against degeneracy, sexual immorality that's being not just allowed in our culture, but celebrated, and attempts to normalize it and indoctrinate children into these kind of things. Like, we should be active in pushing back against that. But the state is not only not a biblical, is not the instrument by which we should be fighting that, but rather I would say that historically the state is the greatest underminer and subverter of Christian values in human history. I think, and again, that's, I think, both biblical history and post-biblical history. And that's just by analyzing what the state is. And we didn't get into this because there's different conceptions of, we talk about at LCI how you can even have civil governance without what we call this modern idea of the nation state. But if you're going to have governance, whether that's through a state or something, some other type of, organization and implementation of law, that when we go outside of those narrow prescriptions, that we have opened the floodgates by which then the incentives by which especially states operate is that people tend to operate in government with much higher time preferences. They aren't as concerned about actually governing for the good of the people, but they can be incentivized to govern in such ways that protect their interests, that help them to hold on to power, and that especially cross generations, that, and this is especially true, I think, in our modern republics, that people don't, in government, don't have a continuity where they kind of view their responsibilities in that sort of like long-term view of sort of trying to steward something that they're responsible for, but rather it's like, well, I'm only temporarily, a custodian of this, and so I'm just going to maximize the good of myself, of my financial backers and things like that. And so these incentives are hard to eliminate, even if you put Christians into those positions. And actually, those incentives make it harder to put, biblically faithful Christians into those positions. And it's because of that I think the only real answer is to curtail government back down to the narrow, limited scope that I'm prescribing here, because then that frees us up as Christians to not be fighting this battle against degeneracy on two ends. We're always going to, while we live in this fallen world, struggle, insofar as we are soldiers for the kingdom of God and we are proclaimers of the gospel, we will have to struggle against those who are enemies of this gospel and who want to advocate that people reject it in favor of embracing sinful lifestyles and embracing even overt rejections of God. But we create a more uphill battle for us when we give those people an instrument of power that's already like pre-equipped with the interventions into private life to then use against us. I don't think we can use those I'll use them, those, what's the word I'm looking for here? They are, I'm struggling for the word here, distortions. There we go. When we distort the biblical role that I think that I tried to explain here, that I think is prescribed, those distortions, because they're not the biblical prescribed role, they're not going to serve our interests. They're going to serve the interests of those who are our enemies. So
Gotcha.
That'd be my closing thought of kind of like where I'm coming from, is that should we have a Christian nation, like in a general sense? Yes. The gospel is for everyone, for all people, and for all nations. And, the church's job is to go out there and proclaim that good news to the people. We can do that better when we keep government in the narrow corner of administering civil justice like it's supposed to be.
Okay. No, that's a good wrap up. I appreciate that. So we got Jacob Winograd. Check him out. Biblical Anarchy podcast. Also over on the want to make sure I get it right. Libertarian Christian Institute. But yeah, Jacob, thank you for chatting, man. It's a big topic. There's lots of little potholes along the way, but this has been fun. So I appreciate the chat.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and happy to do it again sometime. All right. Well, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. I thought it was pretty good. We covered a lot in a, I guess, kind of short period of time. I enjoyed the conversation. Hope that they'll invite me back on sometime, or maybe I'll invite Josh on my show and get to know his views a little bit more, because I found him to be very personable, very good faith. And so, but yeah, that's all I have for you guys. Make sure you give this video a thumbs up for those of you watching on the YouTube, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And then those of you listening on the audio end, 5-star reviews always help. But that's all we have for you. So until next week, as I always conclude by saying, live at peace and live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.